Hello, Eastern Panhandle Board of Realtor membership. I have Matt Leonard here with me today, and I'm Angela Horner from Remax First Realty, and we're going to bring you your next education connection. And we just want to make sure you understand that we're here to bring you an understanding today of the 1031 exchange addendum and also the West Virginia non-resident sellers disclosure withholding tax addendum. And we always tell you to seek your broker's advice on any further questions and directions with these forms, and we just want to bring you an understanding and help you bring education to these documents. All right, Matt, so I have a buyer prospect that was referred to me, and we had a conversation today about his potential purchase. He has mentioned being on a time frame to find a property to complete an IRS Section 1031 tax deferred exchange. I do not have experience with this type of transaction. What do I need to know to prepare my client?
Okay, so from a 1031 exchange perspective, there's a few general things that would be helpful as a realtor to know to inform your client. The two main things are if they have 1031 money in an exchange already that's being held by a qualified intermediary, they will need to close any property that they're going to purchase within 180 days of the date that sale of their exchanged property occurred. Additionally, before that, they have to identify a property. You can identify, I think, a few properties in which you are looking to purchase as options. You have to identify those within 45 days of the sale. Let your qualified intermediary know that, and then close within 180 days, not an additional 180 days, same sort of calendar time frame. So 45 days, know your new properties, 180 days close.
Okay, so time frames are important for this transaction.
Very much so important. If you don't meet those time frames, then you are likely to lose whatever benefits you gain from the 1031.
Okay. So it mentions when I'm filling out this 1031 exchange addendum that we should make a part of a transaction that we know that our clients are going to have a 1031 exchange transaction, that there's an intermediary. What is an intermediary? What is their role? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, so an intermediary is somebody that handles essentially the funds and then make sure that all of the requirements under the federal statute for 1031 exchanges are met. So the intermediary, once that's set up, the person closes, sells their house, the intermediary receives those funds. They hold those funds in essentially escrow until the 1031 is completed on the backside. They also will be the ones receiving the contracts. They'll have other documentation that the seller/purchaser would need to sign. Both parties on a 1031 side usually need to sign some sort of documentation. But basically they're there to keep everything in check, moving smooth kind of throughout the process to make sure all the timelines are met.
Okay. Who is responsible for hiring, paying, and coordinating with the intermediary?
Okay. So the person utilizing the 1031 would be the one responsible for hiring, retaining, paying the intermediary. A lot of times they pay them outside of settlement, but of course, people have referrals if you've worked with somebody before, but they're the ones that ultimately need to coordinate that.
Okay. Will there be a cost to the other party? So if my buyer hires the intermediary, will there be any cost that my seller will have to absorb because of that?
I know your seller should absorb no cost based on that 1031.
Okay. We've already mentioned the timelines that they have to find that property within a certain time. So does it take any longer for us to prepare and go to closing versus a normal transaction without a 1031 exchange involvement?
I don't think so, and actually I think it could be quicker because the funds are essentially there and readily available. So as long as the back-end paperwork's done, I think it could be a rather quick close, almost akin to a cash versus a traditional financing timeframes.
Okay. If I had to have a seller as a client and list a property to place into a 1031 exchange, what does the seller have to have in place?
Okay, so what the seller would want to do is make sure they try to find an intermediary. Don't wait till 2 days, 3 days before closing. Try to get all that set up ahead of time. Talk to different ones, see what their funding is. And that's the main thing. Find an intermediary, make sure you go over your goals with them. What kind of property you're looking for? Does this exchange make sense for me? And then, just make sure everything's in place so you don't have to lose the benefits if you did decide I wanted to do it, but oops, I waited until 2 hours before closing. I can't do it now.
Okay. I've heard about a reverse 1031 exchange. Can you explain what the difference that is than the normal 1031 exchange?
So they're a little more complicated. With a reverse 1031, you buy the property ahead of time. And then you sell what would be a relinquished property. So if you own an investment property, you buy a new investment property, then you have sort of the same time frames to sell your current property you own to then funnel that money to the new property. Most people aren't going to have the capital to be able to do that, but it is something that is available to your clients and would be a good option to talk to your intermediaries about.
So if my client was trying to do a 1031 and they have the financial ability, they could go ahead and buy that replacement property before the sale of the 1031 exchange property.
That's correct.
Okay. And is there, whenever I'm using this addendum, both parties need to sign this and agree that they have certain responsibilities to the 1031 exchange process?
Yeah, that's correct. Most of the time it's just as simple, at least, so if your purchaser is using 1031 funds, the seller is as simple as signing, documents. As we understand the purchaser is using 1031 funds. You don't really have far out of the way any extra burdens, any extra responsibilities. Okay. And most of that's done at the settlement table.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for giving us a little bit more insight on the 1031 exchange addendum, how that process and transaction works, and that it's not really going to be any kind of transaction that makes anything difficult for us. But we should be aware that there's time frames and there's certain other parties, such as the intermediary, that needs to be involved. Of course, again, we want you to know we're providing you this education. You should always consult with your broker for more information and direction on this addendum and document. And also you should always seek legal, financial, and tax counsel before entering into an IRS Section 103 1031 exchange. Now we're going to switch over to the West Virginia non-residents withholding for sales of real property. So Matt, I'm meeting with a prospective listing client. They live in Maryland. Do I need to include the listing addendum for the West Virginia non-resident withholding?
Angela, yes, that's a great point, and it would be a good idea to have that form twofold. A, it kind of brings to the front, here's this tax, let's talk about it, and B, then it lets, particularly your settlement agent know that they're an out-of-state resident and to be on the lookout for that, to be able to handle it.
Okay. Does this apply to all out-of-state sellers?
As a general rule, yes. If you're an out-of-state resident, it does apply to you as a blanket. There's a few exceptions. The main one would be, if you lived in just Charlestown for the last 5 years, you just moved to Maryland, but the Charlestown home was your prime residence, you wouldn't have to pay the West Virginia withholdings tax if it's a prime residence sort of thing. You get into a time frame with that. And then otherwise, mostly then yes, there's some accountant exceptions, etc. But
okay.
Yes.
So I should probably have every seller that I represent acknowledge and sign this form when I know they're an out-of-state resident, and then let it be up to the closing attorney to then follow up and reaffirm whether that a tax will apply when they go to settlement.
Yeah, that's correct. So most of the time, at least from my perspective as a settlement attorney, we see they're an out-of-state resident. We try to talk to them about it and say, here's this tax. Was this your prime residence? A lot of times it's not, and then it's okay. Well, here's what we need. We're going to have to collect this, and then they get into, well, do I need to pay it? Do I not need to pay it? That is a accountant, tax professional question. I don't feel comfortable making that decision for people. You know, you could get into was there capital gain, is there not? But as a general rule, if I know somebody's out of state, unless they provide me some sort of evidence that they're not subject to it, then we're going to collect it.
Okay, so that kind of leads into, if I have a seller and they ask how much of their funds are going to be expected to be withheld, then most likely I'm going to tell them we're not going to know that until we get to the end at settlement, and these funds may actually not be what has to be withheld, and you can file this return.
That's correct. So general rule, 2.5% of the net proceeds are withheld. That's, you take out payoffs, commissions, and closing costs. If you knew what kind of capital gain you were experiencing, most people don't. You could take 6.5% of that, but we don't have most of that information until the end. So as far as here's my number, of course we're not going to know what it is. You could always, if you're asked that as a realtor, refer people to the settlement agent. You know, if we have a good idea of what the payoff is, we can calculate that for them. And then, like you mentioned, you could apply for a reimbursement of the West Virginia withholdings tax after it's filed. There's two ways to do that. You can file a tax return, or there's a separate form that the settlement company can give you that'll let you, fill it out, send it to the state tax department, and then be able to apply for a refund of the withholdings tax. Whether or not you get the refund is a good accounting question, not a legal question, but I know a lot of clients are at least successful in getting one, or at least a partial one.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for providing some insight on that listing addendum and how that process works. I think all in all, we just have to remember, if we have an out-of-state seller, that we have the conversation and communicate with them that this could be a tax that's withheld at closing, so there's no surprises at the end. So thank you, Matt Leonard with Pill, for helping provide us with some more education on the 1031 exchange addendum and the West Virginia non-residence withholding addendum.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome. And also a reminder that you should always consult with your broker for more direction and guidance on any of these documents.